Okay, let's dive in. What if? What if things like ancient Indian philosophy, consciousness, karma, even falling birth rates and chemtrails,
Yeah.
what if they're all linked by pressure?
Sounds like a bit of a stretch, doesn't it, initially? But yeah, our deep dive today looks at this one specific source. It's an audio recording, actually, that puts forward this pretty fascinating hypothesis.
A unified hypothesis connecting all that.
That's the idea. It's rooted in ontology, the study of being.
Yeah.
And it tries to apply these, well, very deep concepts to what's happening right now.
And the context of the recording itself is kind of interesting, right? The speaker mentioned doing it while, like, really physically working hard, feeling the pressure.
Exactly. That personal experience, feeling that physical strain, apparently sparked this bigger reflection on pressure in a much, much broader sense, almost universal.
So our mission today is really to unpack this source's perspective. We're not necessarily endorsing it, but exploring the ideas.
Precisely. We want to get into the core concepts it presents, see how it draws these lines between seemingly, totally separate things, and just grasp the connections it's suggesting.
All right. So where does the source even begin to build this argument? It points back to India, to some specific thinkers.
Yeah, it mentions Rabindranath Tagore, the poet, briefly. But the main focus for the ontology part is on two others who were around at the same time. Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda, both yogis, deep thinkers.
Okay, Aurobindo and Vivekananda. And the source says they were thinking along similar lines about reality.
That's what the source claims, yeah. That they independently arrived at these comparable conclusions about consciousness and existence.
And what is that core conclusion, according to this source?
Well, it's pretty profound. The idea presented is that supreme consciousness isn't just like a feature of reality. It is reality, the absolute foundation everything comes from.
The ground state, you said.
That's the term used, yeah. The ground state of existence. But then there's the mechanism. That's where it gets really specific in this source.
How this consciousness interacts with, well, us, the physical world.
Exactly. The source posits that this consciousness flows into what it terms the Materium, basically, the realm of matter, our universe.
Okay.
And this inflow, this constant stream of consciousness entering the physical realm, it actually creates pressure.
Pressure from consciousness. Wow. Okay. And that pressure does what?
According to the source, it's the engine behind almost everything. The expansion of the universe, the increase in complexity we see in nature, all growth, even the basis of all energy itself. It all stems from this fundamental pressure.
So it's not just a philosophical idea. The source argues it's physically manifest.
Right. That's a key point it makes. It connects this abstract concept to tangible things.
Like what, for example?
Well, think about it. Physical pressure is everywhere, isn't it? Blood pressure, the pressure in our lymph system, even in our eyeballs. Planetary cores have immense pressure.
Sure. And pressure differences drive weather engines.
Exactly. Evaporation, energy transfer, and physics. It often comes down to pressure differentials. So the source is saying, look, this pressure isn't just some theory. It's a signature of consciousness in the material world. It's everywhere.
Okay. I think I'm following the foundational idea. Consciousness equals pressure in the Materium. So how does the source then jump from that to falling birth rates?
Right. That's the next big step in the hypothesis. It takes this principle and applies it directly to this major global trend.
And it's not just humans.
No, the source is quite specific. It mentions declines in other large mammals, whales, dolphins, also birds, and wildlife more broadly. The hypothesis connects all this to an effect on what it calls the pressure of life.
The pressure of life. Okay, need to unpack that one. Does it relate back to Aurobindo?
It does. The source brings in Aurobindo's concept of the chain of life, but interprets it through this pressure lens. The idea is the fundamental pressure of the universe consciousness flowing in it creates a sort of spark, a spark of life in the ether.
Like the very beginning of a soul.
That's how the source frames it, yes. And this spark then manifests in the Materium. But how? As the absolute simplest life forms. Think bacteria, amoebas. That's the entry point.
So new sparks are constantly being created at that level.
Constantly, according to this view. It's a continuous process driven by that universal pressure.
And then reincarnation, is that part of it?
Yes, very much so in this framework. That initial spark, the soul, it doesn't just vanish, it persists. It goes through life after life, starting with these very basic, maybe rapid life cycles.
And it moves up the chain.
Exactly. It accumulates experience, knowledge. The source uses that term. And over vast timescales, it progresses, reincarnating into more complex forms, multicellular things, insects, various other species.
The source actually puts a number on it, doesn't it? Something about human lives.
It does mention a figure, yeah. 85 million lives is a number cited as a kind of approximation for the journey before a spark is ready for its first human incarnation. It's about the evolution of that soul through experience.
Okay, a vast chain of progression, starting with sparks from universal pressure. So how does that connect to current birth rates dropping? What's the link?
The core claim here is dependency. The source argues that procreation higher up the chain, especially for complex beings like humans and just the overall expansion and vitality of life on Earth, it depends on that constant, fresh influx of new life sparks starting at the bottom.
Like a supply chain for souls, almost, driven by pressure.
That's a way to put it, yeah. The pressure of new consciousness entering at the base level is needed to sustain the momentum and growth all the way up.
All right, this is where it's going to get controversial, I imagine. The chemtrails connection. How does the source bridge that gap?
Directly. The hypothesis presented is, quite bluntly, that chemtrails are deliberately interrupting this fundamental chain of life at the very beginning.
Shutting off the tap, I think that was the phrase used.
Exactly that metaphor, shutting off the tap or closing the valve.
Yeah.
The proposed mechanism is about the materials being dispersed, metals like aluminum specifically and other substances.
Okay, and how do they shut off the tap?
The claim is they poison the environment at the most basic level, soil and water.
And that kills off a bed.
The foundational life forms, the bacteria, the algae, the very things that the source says are the entry point for new life sparks and the base of the entire food web.
So it's a two-pronged attack at the foundation, in this view. Stops new sparks and wrecks the food chain base.
That's the argument. It's presented as disrupting the entire system by poisoning the source, metaphorically closing that valve on new life creation for the planet.
But surely the source acknowledges the more commonly discussed health effects of chemtrails on individuals. Hormones, breathing issues, that kind of thing.
Oh, yes, it does acknowledge those direct harms.
Yeah.
Interference with hormones, general health decline, blocking sunlight, and how those things reduce both the physical ability and even the desire to reproduce in humans and other animals.
But that's secondary in this specific hypothesis.
According to this source, yes. While those direct effects are real and harmful, the primary driver proposed for the widespread cross-species decline in birth rates is this interruption of the fundamental pressure of life at the source, hitting the creation process itself.
Does the source offer any observations, evidence maybe, to back this up?
It offers a couple of points as observational support. One is something many people have noticed: far fewer insects hitting your car windshield now compared to, say, 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, the windshield phenomenon. I definitely remember cleaning my windshield way more often back then.
Right. The source points to that as anecdotal evidence of a massive decline in insect populations, which are a crucial link in that chain of life, just above the microbial level.
Okay, what else?
The other point cited is alarm among fishery biologists. It specifically mentions Washington State, but implies it's broader. Concerns about changes in the water biome, the basic ecosystem in the water harming fish populations.
And the source links that harm directly to
Metals from chemtrails, poisoning the water, killing off the microorganisms and algae that the fish depend on, again, hitting the foundation.
And you mentioned a pattern. The source claims the spraying isn't random.
Yes, this is a crucial part of the argument suggesting intent. The claim is heavy spraying over certain areas implicitly, developed nations in the Northern Hemisphere, but very little or none over places like Africa, South America, or Russia.
That would be a very specific pattern if true.
Indeed. And the source interprets this alleged non-random pattern as strong evidence of an organized program with a specific objective. It explicitly calls it a depopulation agenda.
And the primary mechanism for that agenda, in this view, is attacking the chain of life at the bottom.
That's the core hypothesis presented. Poisoning the microbial foundation is the main tool, with the direct health impacts being almost secondary consequences, or perhaps reinforcing ones.
Wow. Okay. So sticking with this framework, if this fundamental pressure of life is being intentionally messed with, how does the source connect that to things like karma and this idea that we're in a time of secrets coming out?
It proposes a kind of systemic feedback loop. Interfering with that fundamental life pressure, applying negative pressure at that level, it doesn't just stay there. It supposedly creates a shift in the overall consciousness pressure of the whole system.
Leading to
what the source calls blowback, like a recoil. This blowback focuses pressure back onto those causing the initial interference.
So interfering with life's pressure creates pressure on the interferers. Is that the idea?
That's the idea presented, a kind of karmic balancing mechanism inherent in the system. And the source suggests this mechanism is a contributing factor to why so much hidden information seems to be surfacing right now.
Like the pressure forces the secrets out. Information about chemtrails, Epstein, all that stuff the source mentions.
That's the proposed link. The blowback pressure makes it harder to keep things hidden. It forces them into the light.
And there's another angle on pressure too, isn't there? Something about social pressure.
Yes, the source brings in an interpretation of Aurobindo related to social dynamics. It talks about agitator groups, and it lumps together quite a few, like communists, Marxists, fascists, wokists, arguing they inherently create social pressure, tension in the social order.
And like any pressure, it needs a release.
Exactly, that pressure has to go somewhere. Now, the source claims these groups want to control the release, maybe direct it into chaos or revolution for their own ends.
But if they can't control it,
Then the pressure still finds an outlet, but it can blow back on the agitators themselves. That's presented as social karma, basically. The pressure you create comes back at you if you can't manage its release properly.
this leads into another principle the source highlights: escalation.
Yeah, this is interesting. The idea is that once pressure exists in a system, whether it's social, informational, whatever, you have to keep increasing the stimulus to get the same level of reaction you got before. People get desensitized.
And the source uses examples related to information and maybe conspiracies.
It does. It mentions figures like Corey Goode and David Wilcock, suggesting they need to keep escalating their claims, their stories, their predictions, like failed ascension dates, just to keep their audience engaged, to get that same hit of excitement or belief.
And it wasn't just them.
No, the source also mentioned Carrie Cassidy and Mark Richards in a similar vein, needing more extreme stories to maintain interest. And it extends this to politics, too.
How so?
It cites Trump as an example, and implicitly, those reacting to or countering him, suggesting that political discourse has to become more outrageous, more detailed in its revelations or accusations, just to get a significant reaction from the general public, the normies, as the source calls them.
Because people get used to the constant trauma.
Yeah.
The conspiracy world especially.
That's the explanation offered. The audience, particularly those deeply involved, become desensitized to the dopamine rush of revelations. So to get noticed, to create pressure or get a reaction, the claims have to escalate. Bigger secrets, more shocking details.
And did the source make any predictions based on this escalation idea about timing?
It did offer a kind of timeline, yeah. Based on this perceived need for escalating revelations, it suggested that June and July were expected to be particularly intense periods. The phrase used was something like, blow the socks off the normies.
Really intense stuff expected then. And after that,
Maybe a slight dip, a sag in August was the prediction, but then ramping up again for another major period of revelations from September through November and likely carrying on from there, escalation continuing.
so if we try and tie all these threads together, we start with consciousness creating pressure as the foundation of reality, according to this source.
Right. Then we move to the chain of life idea, driven by this pressure, starting with microbes and progressing upwards, and how that's linked to reproduction and vitality.
Then the controversial hypothesis about chemtrails disrupting this chain at the very bottom, poisoning the source of new life sparks and impacting birth rates across species.
Yeah, presented as a deliberate agenda with a non-random pattern, which then leads to this idea of karmic blowback.
Where interfering with life's pressure creates counter-pressure on the interferers, forcing secrets out.
Exactly. And that ties into social pressure from agitator groups and the principle of escalation needed to get reactions in a desensitized environment, leading to predictions of increasingly intense revelations.
It's certainly a comprehensive picture, a very specific, interconnected view, linking the philosophical, the biological, the environmental, and the sociopolitical, all through this lens of pressure.
It definitely is. It makes you pause and think about that final provocation from the source. If this whole framework has any validity, if there is this fundamental pressure of life,
Then interfering with it at the absolute lowest level, the microbial foundation in the soil and water.
the effects wouldn't just stay there. The source argues it has to ripple upwards, affecting insects, birds, mammals, us, and maybe even shaking up the social order and driving the information flow we're seeing now.
So a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. What if pressure really is this fundamental connecting force? From consciousness itself down to the algae in a pond and out to global events and information wars. How does considering that perspective, just as a thought experiment based on this source, change how you might look at the seemingly disconnected events happening around us? And what are the implications if that foundational pressure of life is being deliberately choked off? as this one source hypothesizes. Definitely something to think about.